Welcome. My name is Janet Kirkpatrick, Associate Professor in the School of Politics and Global Studies, and it is a great honor to be here tonight to introduce you to a social critic whom I have long admired, Thomas Frank, a social critic who has examined a range of topics in American politics, such as the seduction of the working class by the conservatives and the abandonment of the working class by liberals. Our distinguished speaker has a PhD in history from the University of Chicago and is the founder of Baffler magazine, the author of What's the Matter with Kansas, Pity the Billionaire, The Conquest of Cool, and Listen Liberal, to name a few. Without further ado, please let me join me in welcoming Thomas Frank to the stage.
That's me. Are we going to turn that off? Or are you guys going to... You're going to stare at that all evening and wonder why I'm not so jolly, you know? And where's my piano? And are we all going to go to a bar later and I'm going to entertain everyone with my... Yeah. And there I am playing Keep Your Sunny Side Up. So optimism is a running joke in my family. No, I should... Positive thinking, right? Actually, I take that back. My family is very serious about, really serious about positive thinking. I'm the one who's I'm the odd man out in that regard. Okay, so it's actually been 2 years, almost to the day, since Listen Liberal was published. It was in March of 2016, and book came out, and I went on what we call a book tour, where you go around the country telling people about what you've written. And what I would say back in the spring of 2016, 2 years ago, the way I would describe it as a book about how the Democratic Party had failed when the conditions for success were perfect. Okay, how the Democrats failed when the conditions for success were perfect. Now remember, this is well before the election of 2016. And the failure that I was referring to back in the spring of 2 years ago had to do with economic inequality, with the way that the divide between the rich and everyone else had grown and grown and grown during the years of Barack Obama's presidency, despite the many chances that Obama got to take action on the matter. Because if you ask me, talk about chances to take action on the matter, that's what the 2009 financial crisis was. The perfect opportunity to launch this country on a different direction, to put an end to the era of deregulation and financialization that we've been living through ever since 1981, since I was a little boy in that house in Kansas City. Okay. How the Democrats failed when the conditions for success were perfect. The phrase now has an even deadlier ring to it, because now we know what that refers to, the way that the Democratic Party managed to lose to Donald Trump, who, lest we forget, was the most unpopular presidential candidate of all time. This is a guy that went around the country on the campaign trail, that thought that the way you run for office was by mocking different ethnic groups, making fun of handicapped people, letting your phone ring in a crowded auditorium. Just kidding about that. I don't mean to compare whoever you are to Donald Trump. That would be cruel. It gets worse. Anyhow. But think about, remember how that guy thought you should run for president, making fun of handicapped people, picking a fight with the parents of a soldier killed in Iraq. They even caught him on tape boasting about groping women, okay? This is a man that had never run for public office before. His campaign manager, Steve Bannon, had never managed a political campaign before. This is a guy that knew nothing about governing. And if you ask me, really has no business being in the Oval Office. How do you lose to a guy like that? Well, the Democrats found a way. So what I'm going to suggest here this evening is that these two big failures that I'm talking about are actually one failure, okay? That these things go together. That the Democrats' failure to do much of anything about inequality when they had a chance sprang from the same source as their failure to understand Donald Trump and his followers. And both of these failures came from the same basic class assumptions of the Democratic Party leadership. All right, let's start by talking about what this country looked like 2 years ago, the country that elected Donald Trump as its leader. 2016, it was a time of brisk prosperity in the United States, according to all the official measurements. The unemployment was down, the stock market was up, much as it is today. For Americans who worked for a living, however, nothing ever seemed to improve. Wages didn't grow. The median household income was still well below where it had been in the year 2007, before the financial crisis. The economists have a way of measuring this. They call it the labor share of the gross national product, as opposed to the share taken by stockholders, that sort of thing. And the labor share hit its all-time low since records started being kept. Its all-time low in the year 2011, and then it just stayed there, right at the rock bottom, right through the next couple of years. In the fall of 2014, with the stock market hitting all-time highs, a poll showed that nearly 3/4 of the American public believed that the economy was still in a recession. Because for them it was. Now, folks, there was a time when average Americans could be counted upon to know correctly whether the economy was going up or going down, because back in those days when America prospered, the American people prospered as well. But these days, things are different. Okay, let's talk about let's put some numbers on this. From the middle of the 1930s up until the year 1980, sort of the great heyday of the New Deal in this country, the lower 90% of the population, a group that we might refer to as the American people, that group took home 70% of the growth in this country's income, okay, during the great New Deal consensus days. The vast majority of the American population took home the lion's share of the growth in this country's wealth. That's as it should be. People who are my age often think. Okay? If you look at the same numbers beginning in 1997 and going up to the present, from the middle of the great dot-com boom up until today, you will find that this same group, the American people, pocketed none of this country's income growth at all. Their share of these great good times was zero. The upper 10% of the population, by which I mean the country's financiers and managers and professionals, they ate the whole thing. To be a young person in America today, I think, is to understand instinctively the downward slope that so many people are on these days. College costs are out of control. The university where I got my PhD back in the 90s now costs $70,000 a year to attend. Okay? 4 years of that is north of $250,000. You want to go to a school like that, you got to take out a lot of loans. I mean, a lot of loans. And as I travel this country over the last couple of years, I am continually meeting people, kids, who are $100,000 in debt. I meet them all the time. And they are starting out life in this Uberized economy of ours with the equivalent of a mortgage, but with no house to show for it. You can't sell your college degree like you can a house. Now, at the other end of the social ladder, of course, it's all upside all the time. Back in 1980, it's a golden age for the people on top. Back in 1980, American CEOs made about 40 times as much as their average blue-collar line worker. Today, it's 335 times as much. One particularly fortunate American family, in fact, has as much wealth as does 40% of the population of this country put together. One family. The main accomplishment of the people that make up this family. The main accomplishment was to inherit shares in Walmart, the retailer that has sucked the life out of thousands of towns in the part of the country that I come from. And that's where we are, folks, 10 years now after the financial crisis. Growth that doesn't grow and prosperity that doesn't prosper. The country, and I think everybody understands this now, this country is no longer arranged in such a way as to make its citizens economically secure. And folks, that's the country that elected Donald Trump as its president. What I'm telling you is that the middle class is disintegrating in the great middle class nation. And there is outrage and there is fury around every corner. And you all know this. You talk to anybody on the street and it comes pouring out. Now, you would expect everything I just described, I mean, these horrifying statistics, you would expect this stuff to lead to a revival of the political left. And the reason you would expect that is because that's what happens. That's what always happens. That's the way history is supposed to work. And that's the way, in fact, it has worked in the 1930s, in the 1890s. But here's the fascinating thing. The politics of this age of inequality that we've been living through for all these years, the politics of this age of inequality have been dominated by right-wing revolts that only accelerate the disintegration of the middle class. It's Trump right now. But in truth, and depending on how you count it, this is the 5th successful conservative uprising to happen in my lifetime. So I missed Barry Goldwater. I wasn't born until the year after that, and he didn't succeed anyway. But think about it. You had Nixon in 1968. You had the guys that called themselves the New Right and Ronald Reagan in the late 1970s. You had Newt Gingrich and the Republican Revolution, they called it, in 1994. You had George W. Bush in the year 2000, and then the Tea Party movement in the year 2009. And it just keeps chugging along. Now, to understand how crazy all of this is, and I think it is, well, it's my life's project to study this, but every now and then I take a step back from the text, and it is crazy what is going on in this country and what has been going on since the early 1980s. And as a way of pointing that out, I want to remind you what things looked like in 2009, okay? I'm going to keep coming back to the year 2009, 9 years ago, after the financial crisis and the Great Recession had happened. The Great Recession was underway. President Obama had been elected. And it looked like the philosophy of free markets, the sort of philosophy of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, that this philosophy had been discredited for good. That's what it looked like to me in 2009. Here we had, in this country, we had deregulated Wall Street. I mean, we had got down on our knees and worshipped Wall Street. We had put these nice, friendly Wall Street guys in charge of supervising Wall Street. And here Wall Street goes and poisons the economy of the entire world with its toxic mortgage-backed securities. And so 2009 felt to me like a historical turning point. I thought it was 1932 all over again. Right? Here, the George W. Bush administration, these guys had blundered into disaster after disaster. Remember the Iraq War, Hurricane Katrina, the Jack Abramoff lobbying scandal, on and on and on, and now economic catastrophe. And it felt like the last straw. And the wise men of Washington, where I live these days, they thought they understood what was going on. And they said the tectonic plates were shifting. Conservatism's long reign was finally at an end. They said the age of Reagan was over. The liberal age of Obama was dawning. They said the pendulum had swung one way and now it was going to swing back the other. That's just how history worked. That's how gravity worked. You didn't have to do anything. It just, it went one way and then things go the other. Back in 2009, the pundits loved to talk about how the Republican Party, the unrepentant Republican Party, was on what they called a political suicide mission. how its candidates, I'm not going to give you the names of the pundits who made these dumb remarks, but they're all still in business, the pundit business. I mean, of course, right? They were on the political suicide mission. Republican candidates, they said, had zero chance in the enlightened new America that we were living in. The GOP was being sent, they said, to the dustbin of history. It was exactly, the reason I bring all this up, it's exactly the same script as we saw in 2016 and that we see today. Exactly the same, with commentator after commentator insisting that Donald Trump didn't have a chance, that the Republicans had destroyed themselves by nominating him. By the way, to make it clear, I think the commentators back in 2009 were right about one very important thing. The free market philosophy should have died that year. That should have been the end of it. But here's the important point. That wasn't something that was just going to happen all by itself. Okay? The pendulum doesn't work that way. And the Republican Party was not interested in its own demise back in 2009. And they did exactly the opposite of what the Washington pundits told them to do, advised them to do. You guys have read the New York Times and the Washington Post. What does a pundit always say? If you're having political problems, what do you need to do? Hie thee to the center, right? Of course, get to the center. You got to move to the center. You got to move to, what's your problem? You got to move to the center. Whatever it is, I don't know what you've done wrong, but you got to get to the center. That's the only answer for whatever ails you politically. That's always the answer. It's the answer in every situation, right? The median voter theorem. So, I'm sorry, I'm not teasing the political scientists, but that's where they think they get that stuff from, right? Anyhow, that's what every pundit recommends always in every situation in Washington, and the Republicans didn't do that. They did the opposite. They stepped on the gas instead of the brakes. Instead of moving to the center back in 2009, they purged their moderate faction, and they responded to the failure of free markets by becoming free market zealots. I'm referring to the Tea Party movement here. Remember waving their copies of Ayn Rand in the air. And in 2010, this radicalized Republican Party scored its greatest victory in congressional elections in many decades. They took some 600 seats from the Democrats at the state legislature level. They purged countless Republican moderates. In Kansas, they chopped off the moderate faction. I've never seen anything like it. And then in 2014, of course, they went on to conquer the U.S. Senate. And today the tragedy is complete. They control Congress, the presidency, the Supreme Court, and the most state legislatures that they have since the 1920s. I mean, folks, this is a wipeout that I'm describing, a wipeout for the Democratic Party and also for those pundits who have so persistently taken Democratic victory for granted. And all of it is going on, remember, while Wall Street loots the world and the middle class of this nation falls apart. 15 years ago, I wrote a book about right-wing populism in my home state of Kansas. I had a line in that book that I'm very fond of that I thought was really clever. I said that out here in Kansas, the gravity of discontent pulls to the right and to the right and further to the right. Okay? The gravity of discontent. And when I wrote that, what I was trying to say was that this was a kind of an aberration, this crazy thing that's going on out in the high plains. You know, it's the opposite of the rules that have applied to Western civilization ever since the days of the French Revolution. You know, the gravity of discontent pulls to the left, not to the right. That's the way it's supposed to work. But today, however, I mean, everywhere you go is Kansas. The gravity of discontent pulls to the right everywhere you go in this country. Hell, everywhere you go in the Western world these days. Italy, just the other day, England, Brexit, France, Holland, Austria, even Germany. Why does it work that way? Why? What's happened? Now, to stick with our own country, One reason that I want to talk about tonight is because, the obvious one, well, it's not obvious. It's only obvious if you've read my writing. I mean, nobody else writes about this stuff. You know this, right? It's like nobody in this country writes about this in a straightforward way. It's that the Republican Party is extremely comfortable with the language of class anger, the language of populism. And they speak it very naturally. It just rises to their lips. It's second nature. They love to rail against what they call the elite and our rigged system. They love to complain about the Hollywood millionaires, the arrogant people that make our TV shows, the haughty professors who indoctrinate our kids. They pretend to love the people that they call the real Americans who inhabit an imaginary place that they call the heartland. And they deliberately mimic left-wing protest movements from days of yore. I mean, deliberately, and there's hundreds of examples of this. It's fascinating. But the one that springs to mind these days is the Tea Party movement. Well, I'm going to give you a bunch of examples, but the Tea Party movement, that's what it was. It was a fake hard times protest movement. I mean, they deliberately ginned it up to look like something out of the 1930s. Glenn Beck, remember this? Mimicked Martin Luther King's March on Washington, had that rally on the Lincoln Memorial. Paul Ryan, who's today the Speaker of the House, back in 2009 wrote an article in Forbes magazine that he called "Down with Big Business." This is Paul Ryan. He's at the barricades, denouncing big business. And of course, once they get in office, they make the problem worse. The Tea Party movement, think of what they've done with the austerity, the debt ceiling battles, more deregulation, on and on and on. And now here comes Donald Trump. America's blue-collar billionaire is what they called him at the Republican convention in Cleveland in the summer of 2016. I was there. I heard it with my own ears. And he gave, his acceptance speech, and it was probably one of the better speeches that he's ever given. He restrained himself and he read from the teleprompter, and he did a pretty good job. Everything else about that convention was a complete botch, by the way. We'll talk about that later. But his speech was actually kind of good. And in it, he pledged himself to the working class voters. And by the way, he will actually use that phrase, working class. It's, a lot of people think that is verboten. You can't say it. You can't even utter those words. He says it all the time. And in his speech, he said this: "I have visited the laid-off factory workers and the communities crushed by our horrible and unfair trade deals." Okay, he goes on. Now listen, this is an exact echo of Franklin Roosevelt. "These are the forgotten men and women of our country, people who work hard but no longer have a voice." Then he went on, same speech, and tried to reverse the traditional liberal criticism of Republicans as being pawns of the billionaire class, the Koch brothers and all that sort of thing. Here's what Trump said: "Big business, elite media," big business. Like Trump is denouncing big business. Seriously. He did this. Okay, big business, elite media, and major donors are lining up behind the campaign of my opponent because they know she will keep our rigged system in place. And rigged system, of course, he stole that from Elizabeth Warren. He goes on. "They are throwing money at her," meaning Hillary, "because they have total control over every single thing she does. She is their puppet, and they pull the strings." Now, look, folks, Donald Trump is a bigot and a vulgarian and totally incompetent, if you ask me. And if you try and sit down and think of what this guy is actually going to do for the working class people of this country, the answer is very close to nothing. I mean, the one great accomplishment of his first year in office was the gigantic tax cuts for corporations, which will allow fantastic, it'll be great for the stock market, incredible share buybacks and CEO paydays, windfall dividends for shareholders. But, in that big tax reform, they didn't bother to close the carried interest loophole, even though he campaigned on that and talked about it, hundreds of times on the campaign trail. Oh, but it slipped their mind when it came time to draft the bill. The dude has basically declared open warfare on the federal agencies that matter most to the quality of middle-class life in this country, the EPA. Right now, as I'm speaking, they are shutting down the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau in Washington, D.C. They just deregulated Wall Street again. Trump tried to appoint as his labor secretary the CEO of a fast food chain, And that is what I mean by the vicious circle. In our rage against elites, and I think that rage is not necessarily misplaced. I think there's a lot of validity to it, but in our rage against elites, we elect these politicians who only make the situation worse. Why does it happen? Why does it keep on happening? Well, consider Donald Trump and what he said at the Republican convention, the quotes that I just read to you. When he said those things back in 2016, Donald Trump connected emotionally, as he often did in his speeches. He's right. When he says that the system is rigged, that is true. He's right when he pointed out that huge parts of this country have been deindustrialized and that is a terrible thing. That is a correct and true and valid statement. He's not trying to brush it off or say they needed better college degrees from better schools, or maybe they should all just move to a place like Phoenix that's booming. Maybe they should forget about living in Missouri. He didn't do that. He actually pretended to care about those people. What drives me absolutely crazy, folks, what keeps me awake at night and what makes me write these books is that those are the things that my side used to say. The stuff that Trump is saying now. That's what my team used to say. So why does the Republican Party win, again, in these improbable situations? Why does conservatism just keep chugging along? Because it is comfortable today with discontent. They used to have a slogan, actually, back in the 1970s. Oh, damn, now I can't remember what it was. Howard Phillips, what was the slogan? Organize discontent. This is one of the leaders of the new right, as right-wing as they come. Organize discontent. And my side, the Democrats, it's always like, let's move to the center, let's be rational, let's be reasonable, let's everybody go to college. Talk this out now. Don't get emotional about it. We'll meet in the middle and we'll get do the deal. Organize discontent. Which is going to win? Which philosophy? Come on. This is the last time I'm ever going to give this speech, so I can say whatever I want. It doesn't matter. All right. So where are my guys in all of this? Where's my Dems in all of this? If you're as old as me, you will recall a time when protecting the middle-class society is what the Democratic Party was all about. They'd never shut up about it back in Lyndon Johnson, Jimmy Carter days. That's everybody knew that's what the Democratic Party was. That was who they were. And I think you take Democratic leaders of the past and put them in this situation that we're in today, and they would know exactly what to do about it. Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, Lyndon Johnson, Hubert Humphrey. These guys would have taken one look at what Wall Street is doing to this country, at what's happening to ordinary middle-class Americans, and they would have swung directly into action. But our modern Democratic leaders falter. Yes, they know that inequality is bad, and they cry big fat tears about it. But they cannot find the conviction or the imagination to do what is necessary to put this thing into reverse. Instead, they offer us the same high-minded policy platitudes that they have been dishing up since the 1980s. They tell us that, it's really awful what's happening to you, but there's nothing you can do about technology, right? Nothing you can do about that. Nothing you can do about globalization, right? That's globalization. That is the hand of God Almighty, the invisible hand of God reaching down into human affairs on behalf of the entire globe. And just, reordering our society as God himself sees fit. There's nothing you can do about that. You can't resist that. You just have to accept the way things are. And so they promise us charter schools and more job training And oh yeah, they'll shovel out the student loans. But other than that, folks, they got nothing. The example I want to talk about tonight also comes from 2009, the same year that the pundits were declaring the Republican Party dead for all time. The issue I want to discuss with you in some detail, not a whole lot of detail, but a tiny bit of detail, is the issue of the Wall Street bailouts. And I want to talk about the Wall Street bailouts because I think it was the most important issue of this stupid century that we're living in. I think this was the inflection point where our country could easily have chosen a different course, a different path to go on. The power was totally in our hands at that moment. Folks, this was the historical turning point, and we missed the turn. I want you to remember what it was like back in those days. Barack Obama had been elected president on an enormous wave of hope and enthusiasm, and I was one of the hopeful ones. I was one of the enthusiastic ones. And he had the country at his back. He had the whole world at his back. And then he proceeded to continue the bailout policies of George W. Bush, essentially unchanged. No big banks ever got put into receivership. No bailouts ever got unwound. No elite bankers ever got prosecuted. Hell, they didn't even get fired. He did fire the CEO of General Motors, but not Goldman, right? Not J.P. Morgan. Oh, no. What I'm saying is that the Democratic team refused to change course when every sign said to turn, when it would have been good for the country to turn. I mean, economically healthful to be shed of Wall Street. I mean, when it would have been, it was totally within his power to turn at the time. He had seats, because of the bailouts, he had seats on everybody's board. He had complete control over all of these institutions. He could have demanded the resignation of every director of every bank on Wall Street. It would have been overwhelmingly popular had he done it. We would have amended the Constitution. He'd still be president today had he prosecuted a couple of these guys. And lastly, when the country fully expected the Democrats to make that turn. I mean, that's why we thought we elected them. That's what we thought it was all about. Even the Wall Street bankers expected it. I remember this moment very early in Barack Obama's presidency when he summoned the Wall Street bankers down from Manhattan for a meeting at the White House, and they came, the Big Five and a couple of others. And they came to the meeting, and you see them, the photographs of them going into the meeting, and they are ashen-faced because they know what's going to happen to them. The new Franklin Roosevelt is going to take them to the woodshed, just like what happened to their ancestors back in the 30s. And then you look at the pictures of them coming out, and it's all smiles. And they go up to the microphone and they say, "Nothing changed. Instead, we foamed the runways for those guys. We foamed the runways," in the immortal phrase of Treasury Secretary Tim Geithner. Why? Look, Barack Obama didn't play this greatest issue of our time the way he did because the white working class rose up and rallied around its friends on Wall Street. That is not what happened. And he didn't do it the way he did because the presidency lacks the power. The presidency is an enormously powerful office, as we are reminded every single day these days when we open up the newspaper. No. Barack Obama played this issue the way he did 9 years ago because that's how he wanted to play it. No excuses. And if we want to understand why we got to where we are today, we have to acknowledge that that's the case. Now, I know that's not a sufficient answer, and in truth, we'll never know the answer until Obama writes his memoirs one of these days. But I want to suggest to you that this is not a problem that is unique to him. He's not the bearer of it in truth. None of this starts with Barack Obama. If you want to understand why he chose in that moment of crisis to act the way that he did, you have to go back to the 1970s, the 1980s, the 1990s. And back in those days, the Democratic Party was engaged in this kind of civil war among itself, over who they were and what they stood for. And you had all these different factions in the Democratic Party back then, and they fought like cats and dogs with each other. If you're as old as me, again, you'll remember this, but there was always one thing that they agreed upon. All these different factions, they disagreed over 100 different things, but there's one thing they always agreed upon, and that was that the Democratic Party had to turn away from the legacy of the New Deal with its fixation on working class people. And what Democrats had to embrace, they said, was the emerging post-industrial economy, and the people that the Democratic Party needed to identify with were and this is important, folks, the winners in this new economic order, okay? The highly educated professionals who populate our country's knowledge industries. What do I mean by professionals? We know what the basic 5 professions, doctors, lawyers, architects, engineers, clergy. But today it's an enormous category. It's everybody with an advanced degree. Most of us in this room are trained to be a professional of some sort or another. I'm one, it's a huge category of worker these days. Basically everybody with an advanced degree, white collar, they tend to be very affluent, live in the fancy suburbs, that kind of thing. It includes people like math PhDs who write derivative securities, biochemists who make prescription drugs. Interesting fact about this demographic group, professionals. Back in the 1950s, they were one of the most Republican groups in America in the Eisenhower days. They were one of the most Republican groups in the country. Today, they've completely changed sides, and they're one of the most Democratic groups in America. And what I suggest in Listen Liberal, this is my argument, is that that's who the Democratic Party is now. They are the party of a class. They're a class party, like in France in the 19th century. Okay, they're the party of a very specific social class. It's just not the working class. They're the party of highly educated professionals. Now, we all know the Democratic Party has many other constituent groups, of course, minorities, women, the young, but professionals are the ones who come first. They're the ones who sit in the front seat and have their hands on the steering wheel, and all the rest of us right in the back. It's the tastes and manners of the professional class that are always celebrated by liberal newspapers. And you know what I mean by this. Their favorite TV shows, very special cupcakes. They're very fancy coffee, craft cocktails. It's always something artisanal, Do you have the artisanal stuff in Tucson? Of course you do. Artisanal saguaro. No, there's no such thing. Okay, but just the other day I saw in the newspaper, I'm not making this up, artisanal charcoal. Yeah, I still don't really know what that is, but I want me some. So here's what I'm saying. American liberalism started as a populist movement way back when, but today it is the opposite of that. It is a movement of winners and the highly credentialed. Just think about Hillary Clinton's remarks the other day, her now infamous remarks that she made in India, where she was boasting that she carried the areas that produced like 2/3 of the GDP of this country or something like that, the forward-looking. That's what she means. She's basically expressing my thesis of Listen Liberal by some other language. And over the years, liberals have developed all of these flattering phrases for their beloved professional class, all these terms of endearment. They call them wired workers who will inherit the future. They're supposed to be a learning class that truly gets the power of education. Here's one that you've for sure heard, a creative class. You guys familiar with the idea of the creative class? Is that a big thing in Tucson? The creative class, it's supposed to naturally rebel against fakeness and conformity. Yeah, and you're supposed to build zones in your city to lure in the creative class because you don't want them all moving to Tucson or something like that. That would be disaster. So you have to build special creative zones in your city, innovation areas, all of this kind of crap. And hell, we negotiate trade deals to make sure that the creative class doesn't leave the United States en masse and go to Denmark or some other country that wants to lure them in. And so I'm quite serious about this. This is their rationale for why they put certain things in the trade deals. But think about that for a second. The creative class. I'm fascinated by this term. The idea that creativity is the property of a class, of a really affluent class. Okay, forget it. But think about it this way. Where do the leaders of the modern Democratic Party come from? They always have the same kind of biographical background. They are always plucked from obscurity by some fancy educational institution. Okay, Bill Clinton. He's this kid in Hot Springs, Arkansas, right? And he goes away to Georgetown. He becomes a Rhodes Scholar. He goes to Yale Law School, and the doors of the world swing open for him. Barack Obama has a similar life story, where he goes, with him it's Columbia and Harvard Law School. Hillary, same deal. And if you look at their cabinet choices, it's always the same kind of people, these people who, with these massively impressive credentials. When Obama was president, the Washington Post used to periodically run these news stories, basically marveling at the academic credentials that he had amassed in his cabinet. All of these guys from Harvard, all of these guys from Oxford. He had a Nobel laureate advising him. He had, MacArthur genius people advising him. So here's the idea that I'm getting at, folks. Professionals are a kind of magical class, the creative class, the heroes of history, the sort of the group that stands at the end of this debased dialectic, this upside down Marxian dialectic of creativity and innovation. Okay, the professional class. They also happen to be the number one constituency of the Democratic Party. I thought I saw something up there. The number one constituency of the Democratic Party, and all the leaders of the party happen to be drawn from this very exact same group, okay? So what I'm describing is a shift, massive shift of allegiance in the Democratic Party from the traditional working class, middle class, to professionals over the years. I mean, it took many decades for it to happen, but it's a done deal now. And this shift is what explains, I think, everything, or just about everything, that is frustrating about our modern day liberalism. I mean, think about it, folks. How do you get in a situation, remember the statistics I was giving you at the beginning of the talk, where you're in a situation where inequality is growing. I mean, inequality is out of control, folks. We are on our way back to a 19th century pattern of wealth distribution in this country. I mean, we're there. I mean, this is it. We are living in a Victorian society, basically, in terms of economics, right? We're in that situation, and the party of the left can't take advantage of it. How does that happen? You get in a situation where inequality is galloping, and the party of the left is in a state of historic defeat, where the middle class is disintegrating, and people are turning to a mountebank like Donald Trump. How does this happen? This is only possible, folks, when the party of the left isn't interested in its historic mission. That is the only way you get this combination of inequality and defeat. Why aren't they interested? To understand that, I want to go back again to the problem of the Wall Street banks, the bailouts. I keep coming back to this because, as I said, I think it's the most important moment in our stupid century. Why was it that the Democratic administration failed to do what obviously needed to be done with these guys? Why did Democrats declare that Wall Street executives were going to be held to a different legal standard than ordinary criminals? And they did declare it. The guy who said it, high official in the Justice Department, he had to resign as soon as it became public, but he said it. Why did our modern Democrats choose Wall Street over average Americans again and again and again? Every time there was a choice that had to be made, they came down on the side of Wall Street. Why? Because for the achievement-conscious people who fill Democratic administrations, investment bankers are more than friends. These guys are classmates. They are peers. I mean, they are the face in the mirror when you get up in the morning. I mean, the two groups are the same. Treasury Department, J.P. Morgan, Justice Department, Citibank, they are demographically identical. And people go back and forth through the revolving door, and there is no difference. And they look at, the guys at Justice look at Wall Street, and they see an industry that is filled with people of subtle minds and sophisticated jargon. And, oh God, they love jargon. And extraordinary powers of innovation, right? Financial innovation, right? These are exactly the kind of creative individuals that Democratic Party theory tells us we must honor and respect. You don't break these institutions up. You don't prosecute their CEOs. No, these guys are financial wizards who are plucking wealth from thin air, right? They're making these financial instruments that are so admirably complex. It's like financial rocket science. As one Justice Department official said, financial rocket science, dude, complexity, you can't understand it. And he said this, by the way, as an excuse for why they couldn't prosecute these guys. Dude, it's beyond us. No human can understand these financial wizards. And it's exactly the same when they talk about big pharma. You know this. Oh, so innovative. You can't import generic pharmaceuticals from India. No. You have to protect these innovative companies. You have to protect Pfizer. Oh, folks, mega dittos for Silicon Valley, an industry that can do no wrong in Democratic eyes. I mean, they are so lovable, so professional, so creative, that for this one industry, enforcement of our country's antitrust laws was basically suspended, just for this one industry. Just think about the images from the last 10 years. Barack Obama's bromance with Mark Zuckerberg. Remember this? Which now looks so stinky in hindsight. Facebook, Facebook is real bad these days, folks. Or think of Eric Schmidt, the CEO of Google, hanging around with the Clintons, advising Hillary on her presidential campaign. And if you read Listen Liberal, he pops up again and again and again. I didn't intend it this way. I'm just doing the research. And Eric Schmidt keeps showing up at Hillary Clinton events. When she's Secretary of State. Why? Or think of the Clinton campaign itself, with the most expensive campaign of all time, this great glittering, engine of genius and expertise, all of these computer whizzes, the micro-targeting and the big data. I mean, it was the most advanced political campaign of all time. It was directed, folks, by an algorithm. And of course it failed. So what does a party of the professional class believe in? What does it look like? What does it believe in? The most important item, the only item I'm going to talk about tonight, is meritocracy. The conviction, the faith that the successful deserve their rewards and that the people on top in our society are up there because, God damn it, they're the best. And this is the first commandment of the professional class. Everyone gets what they deserve, and what they deserve is defined by how they did in school. Okay? So the only solution, you've heard this, what's the solution for inequality? If you read the New York Times op-ed page, what's the solution for inequality? Education, of course. The Washington Post, they agree with that, all of them. You go down the list, they all agree. The only solution, the only possible solution is to go to a really good college, a really top-rank school. I mean, the only answer is more education, right? So that's what they have to offer to the guy in rural Missouri watching his way of life crumble to pieces around him. That's the answer. You got to go to MIT or something like that. Folks, this is not a philosophy for reducing inequality. This is a philosophy for rationalizing inequality. It forever pushes the blame back onto the individual. It's always your own fault, no matter what's happening to you. It's because you screwed up in grade school, you didn't get a gold star from your teacher, you didn't go to college, or maybe you didn't finish high school, or maybe you did go to college, but you didn't go to the right college, you didn't go to a good school, or maybe you did go to a good school, but you didn't study the right subject, you studied history instead of the STEM degree, right? And 20 years from now, they'll be saying, well, you studied the wrong subject, you studied STEM when you should have been studying history. It's just always a way of rationalizing it, pushing the blame back onto you. It's a philosophy of winners. folks. And the Democratic Party today is a party dominated by winners. As Hillary herself said, affluent professionals, people who are doing really well in the new economy. Now, as for Trump, I think in some ways he is the perfect epitaph for this era of professional class liberalism. I mean, he is the opposite of everything that the Democratic Party respects. He is completely incompetent. God, what a situation. You have competence that can't, are we being recorded? Yes? Oh, okay. So I can't curse. Okay. None of my jokes. You have competence that, in competence in the Hillary campaign. This is like the most incredibly ingenious campaign of all time. And, can't figure out to go and campaign in Wisconsin, And then you've got Trump who knows nothing about governing at all. What a choice. What a great choice, folks. But it goes on, right? I mean, he holds expertise in contempt. He has no experience in government. He is indifferent to facts. He is a human middle finger to everything that, respect for consensus and process and contemplation, everything that goes to make up our vision of the presidency. He feels like he's one of us even as he destroys our lives. And what's our response to the age of Trump? Now, I know how much fun it is. David Brooks says this again and again and again. It's a lot of fun to think that the real battle is between, this titanic war of enlightenment versus ignorance. And the Times ran another op-ed about this just today. But I can't help but think that the right answer to fake populism is not to go around insisting on what fine and well-mannered people we are, but to give voters the real deal, to show those Trump supporters that we care about them more than Trump does. That yes, the system is rigged, and Donald Trump is one of the guys that rigged it. Now look, I am from Kansas, and I think that populism by itself is a very healthy thing. A suspicion of elites, a hostility towards privilege and arrogance and aristocracy. These are good things. These are things that are deep in the American grain. This is democracy that we're talking about here. It's who we are as a people. And it's not hard to figure out the ways that Democrats could come up with populist issues of their own. I mean, that's who the Democratic Party used to be. Come up with populist issues of your own and bring those voters back into the Democratic fold. I mean, I'll just rattle off a couple of them here. Reindustrialization, that sounds good. Universal health care, I like that. Antitrust enforcement, free college, make it easy to form unions in this country again. It's easy to come up with the issues. They're not radical, they're not strange, they're right out of the old, Harry Truman playbook. And they're the exact same measures. The things that would bring the voters back to the Democratic Party are the exact same measures that would stop the disintegration of the middle class. But I think as things stand right now, the Democratic Party has virtually no intention of doing any of those things, of taking any of that stuff, anything that I've said tonight, of listening to any of this. And what they are currently doing back in Washington is looking for any reason they can find to reassure them that nothing is wrong and that they need do nothing differently. I mean, they'll find a celebrity to be their standard bearer next time, or they'll come up with a better slogan, or this time around they won't give out their password to a hacker, right? And everything will be fine if they just remember to not do that. And maybe they're right in the short term. I mean, Donald Trump is very unpopular today. It is totally possible that the Democrats will get back into office without having to do anything differently at all, just by showing up and being someone other than Donald Trump. I mean, this has been their strategy for 30 years. We're going to win by not being the Republicans. We're the anti-Republicans. That's who we are. But if they, whether they win or they lose with that strategy, it won't really matter, I think, because until the day that they rediscover who they are, until the day that the Democrats do finally change course, we're going to bounce along in this country from government by one set of affluent people to government by a different set of affluent people. And you'll have your consensus-minded Clintonism deregulates the banks, yields to George W. Bush-style authoritarianism, deregulates the banks some more, and on and on and on. We just deregulated them some more the other day. Where will this all end, folks? Where will it end? Only when we, the people, finally come back for our party. Thank you very much. Okay. No questions. I don't believe in that. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, do we have to do it with a microphone?
I think there's a handheld one if people feel the need.
Yeah, I mean, we can just shout.
Shout them out.
Yeah.
If you could just repeat the question so that it gets picked up by the...
Yeah, the camera.
What do you think of Bernie Sanders?
Good one. So Bernie Sanders, I like that guy. Bernie Sanders is, you know, I'm a fan of his. I voted for him in the primary last time around. I think, and he's extremely popular right now, as we all know. I think the interesting thing about, one of the most interesting things about Bernie Sanders is that he is so despised in Washington. You know, he's regarded as, in Washington as a, you know, an outrageous figure, a comical figure even, you know, someone that you don't take seriously. And yet he's one of the most popular politicians in America right now. But that doesn't, like, you look at the way he's treated in something like the Washington Post. So I actually wrote a long essay for Harper's Magazine analyzing the way the Washington Post op-ed page treated Bernie Sanders in the 2016 election. And it's actually really interesting. They were unremittingly hostile to him. I mean, hostile in a way that you rarely see a newspaper go after a political candidate. And he's not a hateable guy. He's not like Donald Trump. You know, he's not a jackass. He's not a racist buffoon. He's not, you know, he's not Donald Trump. But they went after him, you know, as though he was. It was incredible. I know plenty of people that, you know, he calls himself a socialist, and this is supposed to be so disturbing. I know lots of people that find him very reassuring. He's like Harry Truman or something. He's like a voice coming over an old-time radio, you know? And his policy proposals are, you know, things that people remember from long ago. He's not scary. He's not frightening to most Americans. Yeah.
To that point, I've seen Bernie's speech a few times, and I saw him last week, and I feel like a lot of the things he says are just, he's kind of repeating the same dog whistling platitudes that Trump does in a way. The whole like last week he used the phrase "take our country back."
He did?
Yeah, he did several times. And he called for a revolution, and I find that deeply disturbing. And I think.
Oh, you mean the political revolution? He doesn't. Yeah, he doesn't mean like blood in the streets.
I don't know. He talked about the silent majority in some speeches, and I think if you look at recent Democratic victories, Ralph Northam won because college-educated white women came out and voted for him. Roy Moore lost because blacks came out and voted. I mean,
Yeah.
Whites have never voted with the Democratic Party, so why should we? I mean, so after Trump won, I was deeply disturbed, and I reread West Adler's Chance happened.
Yeah.
For a while, I thought that the quote-unquote populism is the way to go, but they're not. I think that this skips over just the large undercurrent of racism.
Look, I don't deny that in the least. No, I think that's totally the case.
How can we implement left-wing populism in the way that it
The key is, how are you going to overcome that? You know, and I think that economic populism is one of the ways that you can overcome that. I think that's. I mean, it's clear to me that that's one of the ways that you can overcome that. I think that the kind of racist Trumpian populism is just the most bizarre, upside down thing. And I know that I'm wrong about this because it's been going strong since the early 1980s. You know, Trump is not new. Trump's slogans, he steals from Nixon, of course. Trump does all the time. He steals from Reagan all the time. I mean, make America. What's Trump's? Yeah, make America great. That's Trump's slogan.
Well, to that point, though, 12% of Bernie voters voted for Trump. That's enough.
Yeah.
That's enough to flip it, Wisconsin. Obviously, like Bernie's message, we're gonna start the factory back up. I'm appealing to the silent majority, aka rotten lights.
Yeah. No, I know Bernie supporters who voted for Trump. The crazy thing to me that I thought was like, these were Republicans. I was like, well, that's really weird that you're considering voting for a socialist. You know what I'm saying? That was what was weird about that. I mean, there's always, that's always what happens in primaries is they, when you have a contested primary. When I grew up, the contested primary that was always on everyone's mind was Kennedy against Carter. And you probably don't remember this, but this is in 1980. Okay, so, and Kennedy did a primary campaign against Carter that year, and he beat Carter in a lot of states, and Carter was a sitting president, and it made Carter look real bad. And Reagan took Kennedy's speeches and ran them as political ads for Reagan, and Kennedy wouldn't shake Carter's hand. You guys remember this? It was bad. But this always happens when you get these very bitter primary battles. But I thought Sanders was I thought he was a trooper about it. He endorsed Hillary and he went around and campaigned for her. I think her mistake was in not. She made a lot of mistakes, but one that's very minor. She should have put the guy on the ticket. And I have no idea to this day why she doesn't like him, they don't get along. That doesn't matter in politics. Put him on the ticket and she would have, there would have never been a problem.
If you look at his history, he said a lot of things that were really impactful. Like he said that red lines were democratic. He said Venezuelan red lines were more democratic than capitalism. My favorite in colleges.
Okay, so I didn't know that he's a fan of Venezuela. I've never heard that before. Okay, so let's go to somebody else. Yeah.
Folks, we're going to pass around the microphone so we can just get it on our recording. Thank you. Look out for the two people dressed in black. They'll take the microphone.
I have one of those over here. So thank you for dwelling on 2009. That was really succinctly put, and that was like my sort of moment of radicalization as well. And now I'm a socialist organizer, kind of to get through the Democratic Party to actually, that's kind of the first block in our way to dismantling capitalism. So I'm wondering if you have any advice for those of us that are trying to go out and sort of make the Democrats do what you are sort of saying they should find in their heart the ability to do.
To make the Democrats do it. Okay, so just so you know, I'm very pessimistic about this personally, but I'll tell you, it's just my nature. I'm a cynical and pessimistic guy, as you can clearly see. You see, it says keep your sunny side up, but then in the background is a bottle of bourbon. But there is, I do want to give you, I don't want to be a complete doom and gloom kind of person, but can I just tell you real quick here, I have been arguing this for a long time. And friends of mine have been making this argument. Many people have made the argument that I've made here tonight, or some version of it, for years. Not the stuff about the professional class. That's all new. That's me. But I was just like my friend Rick Perlstein, who I've known him for a really long time. He wrote a pamphlet. Geez, it has to be 15 or 20 years ago now, where he pointed out that research has shown for decades that the most popular thing Democrats could do would be to promise basically to hold big business accountable and offer a really good welfare state. And this is by far the most popular thing. But their consultants, Democratic political consultants, constantly tell the candidates not to do that. The Democratic Leadership Council, which basically rose up and took over the Democratic Party, and they're gone now, but all their progeny live on, and they run the Democratic Party to this day. They are completely against doing that. Even though that would be the most popular, the obvious course for Democrats to take, especially with inequality, crushing us the way that it is. I mean, it's obvious. It's just incredibly right. It's right there. Everyone can see it, and they won't do it. And they won't do it, and they won't do it, and they won't do it. A friend of mine at the AFL-CIO always says, not always, he said this the other day in a moment of doom and gloom, they would rather lose. They would rather lose than, everyone knows you do that and you'll win. You do this and you'll win. They don't want to do that. Why? Because it would cost them money. And they don't believe in it. Bill Clinton, he doesn't believe in this stuff. They simply don't agree with it. And this is the great promise of centrism was, publicly its great promise was we will help the Democrats, they will win elections. Look at what happened to Walter Mondale, You need us to come in and move the party to the center, and then you'll start winning elections again. But their real promise was we will give you the money. The Democrats came to believe in the 1990s that they had to match the Republicans dollar for dollar, or else they would lose every election. They had to match the Republicans dollar for dollar in fundraising. How do you do that? By not adopting these issues that would obviously win, by staying away from the issues that built the Democratic Party. And then you can reach out to the funders and you can match the Republicans dollar for dollar and you can run a whole lot of TV commercials and then you can win. The ironic, the horrifying thing about the 2016 election was that Hillary followed that script to the letter and lost. And she outraised and outspent Trump 2-1 and lost. Okay, how do you make them do the thing that they should obviously be doing and that anybody that is like literate knows they should be doing? How do you make them do it? You have to build a DLC, that goes the other direction. You have to take over the party. They're not going to do it on their own. They are not going to do it on their own. You cannot reason with them. This is about, it's about votes. And so I said I'd give you a note of hope. And here it is. So when I wrote What's the Matter with Kansas, sitting in my dad's house in Kansas City, but at a typewriter, not at the piano. And I wrote What's the Matter with Kansas, and nobody remembers this part of the book, but it's about a civil war in the Kansas Republican Party between the moderate faction and the conservative faction. And the moderate faction were like the Democratic professionals I described. They were all lawyers, very affluent, lived in the fancy suburbs, and ran the party and never expected a challenge to their rule at all. And the conservatives were blue-collar guys. And they would stand outside the factory gates and hand out leaflets, and they would work in their spare time, and they took over the party from the bottom up, and they did it by hard work. They did it as a hobby, basically. I mean, these guys they weren't professional politicians. They didn't know anything about it. Now, their issues were terrible. Their main organizing issue was anti-abortion, and the results that they achieved are also terrible. It's Sam Brownback. Disaster. But the story of these guys is incredible, that they overthrew the party of Bob Dole and the party of Dwight Eisenhower and Nancy Kassebaum. They overthrew this, Republican Party of Kansas and took it over from the grassroots up. Working class people with no money and no power. And they did it, we can do it too. I talk too much, okay? How many? I can't see a damn thing. You're just going to have to speak up. Who's got the microphone? Okay. Go ahead.
I don't know if I have a question, but I have some thoughts. Well, first of all, I just want to help you with one thing, is that you're in Tempe, not Tucson. And, right? And there's a
Did
thing
I say
about
I was
being
in Tucson? Did I say that?
and
I'm
there's
so
a
sorry.
difference.
I'm
Sun
so
Devils,
sorry.
Wildcats, yeah. So we're,
I hope you will forgive me.
Just to let you should apologize for that. So that's one thing I want to say. But I have more of a thought than anything. Is as you were talking, and I think intersectionality is so important, and you really didn't talk about that or connect intersectionality. So when you're in an audience like this, and I look around, it's majority white, and we talk about the American people or the middle class, it's important to look at that intersectionality, because when we were talking about the black middle class, for instance, that's a different story. The New Deal did not benefit all Americans. It did not benefit poor people. It did not benefit people of color who were mostly domestic. So my auntie, who was a domestic during that time, if she had to work 24 hours to take care of the white male family that was benefiting from that, it did not benefit her. So when I hear that, and I think in an audience like that, when we say that, I think there's just an assumption when we say, we are talking about everybody when we miss intersectionality. And one time you did talk about that, but the intersectionality was when you said, and it wasn't all white middle class. So you made that distinction, which is important. I think it's important to look at that in other areas as well, because it changes the story when we look at that intersectionality. So that was just kind of my thought.
Okay, you make a very important point about the New Deal, but I would like to ask you, the people who I think of as part of the New Deal consensus, Lyndon Johnson, Hubert Humphrey, surely, black voters realize that, at some point, the sort of benefits of the New Deal state did start to come through for black people later on. No, but I'm talking about the 60s here, and later on. Yeah. Okay.
There was a hope, like you said, there was a hope that this would happen.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, well, then, that is a really excellent point, because you obviously can't have a social democratic movement that leaves people behind. You just simply can't have that. It's just not acceptable. Obviously, any kind of social democratic movement has to include everybody, obviously, or there's no point in even signing up for it. But by the way, what you talk about intersectionality, which is, and I love the, obviously it's a great idea, but the part of it that's always left out, and you know this, it's always class. The class is the element that we never like to discuss in America. And so I like to think that my part in that is making people think about class. I always talk about class. Class is always what I go to first of all. But that's just me. You have to take me with a big dose of something else. Okay. I can't see a damn thing.
here.
I've got the wrong glasses on. Okay.
I'd like to get your opinion on automation. It kind of hits the headlines quite a bit. There's a few people kind of discussing in the public discourse about it, like David Autor from MIT, who says that automation is going to hollow out middle-class jobs. Martin Ford is saying that it's going to necessitate a universal basic income. How do you see it affecting inequality?
Well, that's a really good question, and people bring it up all the time. It's up until now. Okay, so the first thing we have to point out is that another name for automation is productivity growth. Productivity growth is at a record low right now. It's extremely low, and this has not, it hasn't been going anywhere for the last couple of years. The next thing we have to point out is that in traditional sort of Keynesian in traditional economics, productivity growth and wage growth were defined as being equal, because they were. If you look at the charts from about the 1930s up to the 1970s, they're equal to each other, or they're very, very close. The two lines follow each other. They track each other very closely. And then in the mid-70s, wage growth breaks loose and starts falling. Okay, and so what that means is that we have enormous productivity advances in our country, and labor is getting nothing, no benefits from it. So it used to be that you would justify or rationalize growing wages in America by saying, well, look, their workers are more productive, so they should be paid more. I mean, it was obvious, and everybody talked about it. And the age of when we had fantastic growing productivity in the 50s and the 60s and up into the 70s, that was the age when wages were growing most. And blue-collar workers were doing really well, in general, when productivity growth. But now we're told that we need to fear productivity growth, that it's going to put us all out of work. And I mean, maybe that's true. Maybe that will come to pass. But it would be a huge historical reversal. Ordinarily, we like productivity growth. It's something that we celebrate because it means workers get paid more. What has changed? How has it gone from being something that we celebrate to something that we fear? This is the big question. And the answer is that workers don't have power anymore. Okay? Why were workers able to demand better pay back in the 60s when productivity went up? Why were they able to do that? Because they had unions. Because they had power. Because you had full employment, and they could either bargain with their employer, or the economy was so tight that the employer had to bid for them. Okay? None of that pertains anymore. Workers are completely powerless in this economy. And so, we have these productivity advances, and they don't share in it at all. And that is the root of inequality. If you ask me, that's the sort of, it's a technical cause of it, that workers no longer have the power to demand their fair share. It all goes to management. It all goes to stockholders. And so you have things like obscenities, like CEOs of these companies taking home 1,000 times what their workers receive, because they can, because the workers don't have the power anymore to demand it. So I think that ultimately, I'm not afraid of technology. I like, I like productivity. I come from a family of engineers. I think it's wonderful when we invent new things. We have to all share in it. Otherwise, it's a terrible thing. Yes, back here.
Due to time
Well,
constraints.
I can't see. Is somebody else got the microphone?
Oh, it's me. Anyway,
Okay.
due to time constraints, this will be our last question.
Okay.
So in your diagnostic of inequality and populism, I wonder if you could speak to, one of the blind spots traditionally of American liberalism and even social democratic movements, the question of U.S. empire. So I wonder if you have any thoughts in terms of how U.S. foreign policy, I mean, if there's one area that there was general consensus between Republicans and Democrats, since at least the early years of the Eisenhower administration, was in terms of foreign policy. So I wonder how this question of U.S. empire and foreign policy shapes or impacts this broader discussion about inequality and populism.
Man. Well, okay, so I've been talking about this book for 2 years, and you're the first one to ask me that. And I don't have an answer for you. I don't do foreign policy, and I'm not a fan of the American empire, and I don't like wars. And, like the Iraq War drove me crazy from day one. And when I was a child, Vietnam was on the TV all the time. And that was awful. And Iraq was awful. And the next one is going to be awful too. And I hate that shit. And I don't, what is it? Its relationship to inequality. That's a really good question. I would suggest that part of it is, of course, that our politicians do this deliberately to get reelected. In the case of George W. Bush, it was planned, it was methodical. He's going to start the war at exactly the right time and not make the mistake that his dad did. Remember, his dad was so popular, but then he'd frittered it away by the time the election came in 1992, and so George W. Bush was going to go to war at exactly the right time. They're so cold-blooded about it. But you're looking for something bigger than that, and I don't know what it is. Maybe you want a hint. Maybe you want to tell me. No?
Yeah, I'm thinking of the most radical social democrats. There's a lot of Martin Luther King, in which he makes this connection.
Yeah.
Intimately related to U.S. and project abroad. And I think that's a discussion that's largely.
That was during Vietnam, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think there's a blind spot that continues in these broader discussions today about inequality and populism that segregate domestic U.S. politics from foreign policy considerations.
But you know what? One of the things that was so obvious in those days and is not clear to us anymore is that we took that war over from the French Empire. The European empires at the time were collapsing all over the world, in Africa and Asia, all over the place, and we were stepping up to take their place, and that was objectionable and loathsome to Americans in all sorts of ways. But one of them is that colonialism obviously perpetuates inequality in a global way. That whole I think, way of understanding the world is gone because nobody even remembers the decolonization struggles anymore. That's all forgotten today. And we also don't generally fight anymore. I mean, I think empire is a correct description of our power over a lot of the world, but it is a metaphor. We don't actually have colonies like, say, the British and the French did long ago, but we're doing the same thing. But it's very hard for people to see. Sorry?
Puerto Rico would beg to differ on the fact that we don't have colonies.
No, I mean, like, we don't, it doesn't, remember with the British Empire, the pink bits on the map, There's nothing like that anymore. And so while we do obviously have an empire, a de facto empire, it's not visible and easy for people to debate. I'm sorry, that is a really unsatisfying answer. Can we do one more so that we get a question I can really knock out of the park?
There was someone over here who had their hand up for a long time, so I'm
Okay.
gonna give it to him.
So I find it very interesting how you mentioned how the Democratic Party is like the political party of the professional class. But there are two things about that I was a little I want your clarification on. The first one is if we were to describe professionals strictly by college degrees, it seems to be if you were college degrees, it's like a 50-50 split, perfect. And if it's postgraduate, then it's like a slightly, but only slightly more democratic. And regardless of who we're talking about, I don't think most professionals are going to benefit if a billion-dollar CEO of Wells Fargo doesn't go to jail. I think perhaps, I mean,
No, that's totally, of course,
Right.
of course. And they can be, and there's plenty of professionals whose heart is in the right place. Here we are, you know. I feel like I'm one of them. So I'm sorry, but did you have more? Or
well,
did
I was just going to end, like, don't you, because I remember in 2008, the biggest thing that everyone was talking about was stability, 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 which is something that professionals, even myself, would definitely prefer. I don't want a revolution.
Yeah.
As much as I hate Wells Fargo, I'm not going to charge up Wall Street with a musket tied to my back. So it is like it's like Democrats seem to always appeal for stability, and Donald Trump in many ways is the antithesis
Yeah,
of
he
stability.
certainly is. So that's a really good question. So the whole critique of the professional class that I made tonight, and I make it at much greater length in the book, but not too much greater length. It's fun to read, and you should all read it. I do it in a way that's, you know, it's a blast. But I should just say there's a huge sociological literature on professionals and professionalism that I read in order to write this. And I don't remember offhand their exact definition of how they define they call it the professional managerial class, how they define them. But it's not always, you don't always have to have an advanced degree. That's just shorthand. That's the way a pollster would do it. But there's other ways of defining it. A lot of those guys on Wall Street, in fact, don't have advanced degrees. A lot of them just have college degrees. But they're considered part of that class anyway for whatever, because of the kind of work that they do. Often professionals are licensed by the state. They're protected. In some ways, they're a protected class. You can't practice law without being recognized by the state. You can't prescribe medicine without, they're protected by various legal things. And what I discovered, there's many important characteristics of the professional class that, you can say all sorts of things about them. They have very good taste. They're really nice. They're very polite. They can be very liberal about, typically they're very liberal about things that don't concern them personally, and they tend to be very conservative about things that do. So they'll be very conservative about issues that immediately affect them, economic stuff, and very liberal about what we generally call the social issues, which they see as affecting, the outside world, people other than themselves. Where this bleeds over into politics, where it becomes really interesting, is three things. They hate labor. I don't mean you. I don't mean us. I mean as a group. When sociologists study them, their hate for organized labor is amazing. It's remarkable. It's off the charts. They look at organized labor as a kind of parody of themselves. They have like their professional associations, and organized labor has their unions, right? But they look at themselves. We got here by merit, by studying hard, by being smart, by being the best. They're just like, they'll take anybody. The Teamsters, anybody can be a Teamster, because the whole idea of labor is everybody is in. We get everybody in, we all get together, and that's how we exercise power. And professionals are like, no, only the best people get in to our organization. So they strongly dislike labor, which has huge consequences for the Democratic Party, which was traditionally the party of labor. They act in solidarity. Well, okay, the way I put it in the book is there is no solidarity in a meritocracy. So these guys have zero sympathy. Professionals tend to have zero sympathy for people who are suffering in the economy. There's no solidarity in this group. And there's been studies of the white-collar workplace, and when somebody gets fired, they don't, as is typical in the blue-collar workplace, people will rally around that person, and try to do something to save his job or help out his family. In the white-collar workplace, they'll be like, he deserved it. He fucked up somehow. He's not as smart as me. We got a lot of academics here tonight. I used to be an academic. We all know that this is how people think about academic achievement and advancement. It's always if you don't get the tenured job, it's your own fault. If you don't get on the tenure track, it's your own. We always push there is no solidarity in a meritocracy. Then the weird thing though is that there is solidarity at the top, among people who consider themselves peers, like really tight solidarity. And that's what you see with the people in the Justice Department and the and the Wall Street banks. And you see this again and again and again, this peer, this regard for, I use the word professional courtesy to describe it. This kinship that they feel at the very top, which is truly weird, but that they will bail each other out without a second thought at the very top, but there's no solidarity with the people below them. Anyhow, it goes on and on and on. I forget what the other point I was going to make about these guys. But it is fascinating since this is the last time I'm ever going to talk about this, when I started reading the sociology of professionalism, which a literature that I was totally unfamiliar with. When I was in graduate school myself back in the 90s, it was a hot thing. Everybody was studying professionalism, but I thought that was bullshit, and I wouldn't read those books. I had no interest in it. And so I finally went back and pulled them off the shelf and started reading them. And I'm like, oh my God, this explains the Democratic Party. All this sociology from the 1990s is fascinating. And I strongly urge you to read Listen Liberal, where I lay it all out for you. And folks, thank you so much for coming. And I love your town of Tucson.